An immediate 100 bonus experience points to everyone who gets the D&D Beyond reference in our title. Welcome to RPGs as Skills and Growth. The games, but everything that's not related to actual gameplay. A little bit more about myself. I am a design manager where I support our designers and a narrative designer at Pickpock, but that's not why I'm here today. I'm here today because when I was 10 years old, somebody introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons, AD&D 2nd edition, by the way, and it blew my freaking mind because the idea that I could create entire worlds and make strategic tactical decisions and either create or participate in a story that changed and reacted to me, fundamentally changed me, and set me on the course to bring me where I am today. So I'm super excited to talk about the meaningful things outside of just the fun of gameplay that it can bring to you.
Hi everyone, I'm JK, Senior Community Manager at Pickpock, and I have loved tabletop RPGs ever since I was a kid. Once I finally overcame my fear of basic arithmetic, my world opened up to Dungeons & Dragons, and I have since then been a part of many campaigns, one-shots, podcasts, and Twitch streams as Blame the Robot or Blame the DM. Also, if you attended Roll Initiative D&D for Everyone on the 20th, you might have been at my table. So,
yeah, with our experience, we could talk about theater or video games, entrepreneurship or art, working at indies, working at large companies, but we're talking to you about Dungeons and fucking Dragons. Why? Good response, by the way.
Well, you see, Rick, over the last 2 decades, tabletop role-playing games have become more accessible and ingrained in popular culture. None represent that more than Dungeons & Dragons. Since its inception in 1974, Dungeons & Dragons has continued to make an impact on video games, film, television, and online media. But not only that has it been used to entertain, in many ways it's also been used to encourage social development and growth.
Yes, and I should say, when we say Dungeons & Dragons, we're using it as like the brand name. We mean any tabletop role-playing game. I've really been enjoying Fate Core, by the way, recently. There's a lot of good ones out there. But yeah, in this age of pandemic, we've learned, of course, that social connection is more important than ever as we've been had it taken away from us. Less so in New Zealand, thankfully. But even outside of that, the ability to improve our communication and connection in both our jobs and our personal lives is so important. Speaking of communication, and this is the important part.
Well, today we ask you to keep an open mind and join us in a conversation on how tabletop RPGs have helped develop skills and growth. A big part of this presentation is discussion, and towards the end of the presentation, we will be taking questions if you have them, or just talking about ways that you might have grown playing Dungeons & Dragons. Please remember to use the hashtag PvP. I keep wanting to say D&D for this. 21 to ask your questions.
And it's not just questions. We would love to hear your own experiences and your own examples as well, which I know is sometimes death when talking to Kiwis, but we're going to try it anyway. Yeah, let's start our game. Dungeon number 1. Your party stands before you, brimming with potential. They're nonetheless awkward, scared, and otherwise untested. It's up to you, their fearless leader, to mold this ragtag band of misfits into a legendary adventuring force. You are the teacher. Welcome to the classroom. So this is me in the middle there. This is when I said goodbye to my students at SAC, which is a creative youth development program, basically growing students as leaders through the medium of art, and in our case, new media and video game design in San Antonio, Texas. This is when they heard that I was leaving for New Zealand, and we had a going away party. It was very sweet. But before that, when we had finished up one of our sessions on board game design, I overheard the kids talking about role-playing games. They were having a discussion. Oh, I've been hearing more about RPGs. Have you guys heard about Dungeons & Dragons? I've been watching Critical Role, all the things Josh said. And they were talking about it, but they didn't know anyone who played or where to start. And I was like, guys, you realize I've been playing this game for like 30 years, right? And they said, and I quote, wow, that's cool. And they weren't ironic. They really thought D&D was cool. And that was the first time I had heard that in my life, that they genuinely thought it was cool. So I convinced my fellow instructors that we were going to run a game for them, not just because it would be a fun way to end this art project that we did, but because I knew that it was going to have real social value for these people. And it did. So I ran a one-shot for them. It was 3 hours with about 12 to 15 students. So first of all, like, if I can brag a little bit, like running a game that actually had a beginning, middle, and end and told a meaningful story for 15 kids in 3 hours is pretty good DMing. Oh, thank you. I wasn't asking for that, but thank you. But more importantly, it brought the value that I wanted. And in particular, I'm going to focus on three things. First of all, it taught them cooperation. These are a lot of students who wanted to do their own individual art, but they quickly learned, through the medium of the game, that in the group setting, if they worked together, they were going to make more progress. They were going to get more interesting stories, they were going to have more exciting moments and rewards, and they were going to bring things forward, versus if they pursued their own agendas. And not just in the game table, but reward psychology backs this up. If you look at the psychological studies, one of the most powerful things that can engage us is the achievement of group rewards and group goals. And they learned that in the game. Second, and this is good for everyone, but especially key for teenagers, was identity experimentation and self-expression. One of the great things about our school is we specifically focused on students from difficult backgrounds or low-income areas. And so we had a huge diverse group of minorities who also had all the difficulties that came with that. And so it was really wonderful to see students in very specific ways, students who were learning their gender identity as, male students playing female characters as a way to work out some of their thoughts on gender, or even just, for example, shy students playing a little bit more of an exuberant and extroverted character, or serious students playing around with making jokes. By having this safe setting that was a little abstracted from who they are, they could learn these real things that they needed to know without the fear of doing it. And it was great. And finally, there was some real conflict resolution. Not just in the conflicts they had on the table, but to give you one example, one of my students, which is pretty typical of 15-year-old boys, was a bit of a troll. Good kid, but knew how to push people's buttons and was prone to just like regurgitating things he had read at the internet without considering their sources. And he played this like thief character who was like trying to sabotage the party. And the rest of the party in character shut him down in a way I hadn't seen in the classroom. It wasn't inappropriate. It was very friendly but very firm in a way that they weren't comfortable being with him outside of the game. And he took this to heart. To his credit, he not only changed his behavior in the game to be more cooperative, I saw him after that game understanding the greater implications of his behavior. But because we gave them the safe space to do it, they were able to practice it in a way that they were afraid to otherwise. So to summarize, role-playing games encourage and even reward cooperation in a way that actually triggers our brain centers. It is a safe space for identity experimentation and self-expression, which is important for everybody, especially in the developmental stages. And finally, it is a real practical way to work on conflict resolutions. So again, by creating this safe, abstract space, people can play these idealized versions of themselves, which then help improve the real versions of themselves, as Josh is going to talk about.
Dungeon 2, the table. You enter a dimly lit room, and in the center of that room, you find a lone standing warrior clad in armor. You find their features strangely alluring, and their stature imposing and confident. In that moment, you realize that you're staring into the eyes of yourself. Or rather, the idealized version of yourself. You are now face to face with your ego. To put it simply, I'd like to quote Game Studies 101. Ego theory is the phenomenon that by taking on an avatar persona in a virtual environment, you're given more agency and control over how you interact in that virtual environment. And with that added self-control comes a greater self-esteem, because that you have things that you can do in the virtual environment that you may not or simply cannot do in the real world. In short, by playing as your idealized self, you gain the ego of someone who is that idealized self. For our players, this is a useful tool when engaging in these soft skills, and it helps us find the version of ourselves we hope to be. As Rick has covered already, communication, self-motivation, and conflict resolution are useful skills we use actively when playing TTRPGs. But we can explore this concept a little bit further when we take a closer look at how we, the Game Master, interact with our player characters. Now, some of the best moments in Dungeons & Dragons we experience through roleplay. Through interactions with NPCs and player characters, we encourage our players to use active listening and critical thinking to collectively achieve their goals. Even Game Masters utilize soft skills such as adaptability, decision-making, and motivation to help encourage our players to think outside of the box. The room is quiet. From the shadows, you can hear the creaking of footsteps above as the bandit leader commands his bands of raiders to search the outpost for you. But before you can make your daring escape, something catches the light from your torch, and also your eye. An ornate wooden chest sits in the center of the room and seems somewhat out of place. What would you like to do? Now, I'd like to think that there are three types of D&D players. Those who simply choose to open the chest, those who will check the chest for traps, and those who will immediately insist that the chest is a mimic. Either way, through this act of describing the scene, we give the players the agency to use lateral thinking and reasoning to consider how to approach the situation. I mean, I could open it, but it seems really weird that Josh went into so much detail about that chest. Now, this can not only act as a way to approach puzzles, but also a way to celebrate victories. Those of you familiar with Critical Role may recall Matt Mercer's signature phrase, "How do you want to do this?" A simple question, but if we consider the communication skills we've developed playing D&D, we begin to understand that not only is this a way to encourage our players to celebrate their victories, but to also collaborate with us, the Game Master, to engage their ego. Many of us use Dungeons & Dragons to play the idealized versions of ourselves that we hope to be. And although D&D isn't necessarily a replacement for empirical learning or education, there are certainly real-world applications to the soft skills we can develop when we roll the dice and engage our ego. Yes?
Yeah, I did want to add, at the risk of reducing 15 years of my experience in different education, from educational games and art teaching and online learning, into a 15-second bit for you. Play is learning. It's what Mr. Rogers said. It's what we know from actual constructivism and experiential learning. By engaging in play, by doing creative problem solving, by engaging in even abstract versions of real-world things, we are learning. So it's actually closer to real education than you might think.
Which brings us to the workplace. You find yourself now at the head of a table. Representatives of neighboring factions and dignitaries surround you, each of them eagerly awaiting your report on the state of their kingdoms and to hear the adulations of the subjects who follow them. I'm gonna do a performance check really quickly on this one. Oh, okay. So we've spoken about the soft skills we engage with as players and the many interpersonal skills that we develop through communication and teamwork. However, there are also many practical skills that we can utilize in the workplace as game masters or dungeon masters. Now, it may not surprise you to hear that the role of a game master is filled with hours of preparation, world building, organization, and of course the real BBEG, scheduling. But in the digital age, we have many tools to help us craft the adventures we share and better organize our time. In my role as Senior Community Manager, these tools are so useful as they help create my master content list and plan many of my social campaigns. Tools such as the Google Workspace, Microsoft OneNote, and Google Forms or surveys are all examples of tools that I've used in both instances. I've also learned a lot about identifying the voice and tone of different communities from the campaigns I've run by identifying player motivations, from those who crave high fantasy adventures like Critical Role, to those who prefer humorous and more contemporary fantasy such as Dimension 20's Fantasy High. Using survey tools helps us understand the needs and wants of our players and helps us craft a better campaign. It doesn't end there though. At PickPock, we've actually used tabletop role-playing games as an exercise to onboard new product owners and designers. One such exercise encourages our designers to run a single campaign, and each take turns as Dungeon Master. When cycling through the Dungeon Masters, you're encouraged to take the story and mechanics a previous DM has laid out and improve on them. You then play through your session and pass it along. Their goal is to learn how to create, carry, and execute a vision. Because at the heart of Dungeons & Dragons, it's an open source game where homebrew rules can change the way we play, which makes it a useful tool for game design.
Yes, and that brings us to our final dungeon. Picture it. The Sword of Truth, the ultimate goal of your adventure, nay, your very purpose for being. But one does not simply walk straight into this well-guarded prize. You must train yourself through a series of challenges, each harder than the last, to hone your skills and gain experience to seek this ultimate prize. The Sword of Truth will let you become that which you most desire, a game designer. I'm being cheeky. I know we're here for a variety of reasons and a variety of goals, but it is a game development conference, and we did want to bring it back around to game design. And often people do ask us in the profession, what should I do to be a game designer? How can I get experience? And besides some of the obvious answers like make games, which is still the best answer, I do sincerely tell people, GM, run tabletop games. You're going to learn so much. It will teach you some hard skills. Now, obviously, there's some game engines and such you need to learn, but making maps full of interesting traps and well-paced encounters, like that has some benefit in content design and level design. Balancing encounters for difficulty and challenge will teach you some of the balancing tools you need. So there's some of that content design tools in there, of course. Obviously, it's going to teach you a bunch of awesome narrative game design skills. You're going to learn branching storytelling, actually how to create multiple paths and multiple side quests and multiple endings. You're going to learn things like, even in the moment-to-moment, interesting decision-making. How do I actually present things that offer me different ways of solving them that I understand? Plus, a lot of the obvious things you might think about in writing for any media. So like world building, character creation, keeping consistent tone, things like that. But most importantly and most broadly, the best skill you can have as a game designer, which is also the best skill you can have as a dungeon master, is thinking about your players. Always trying to put yourself in their mindset and understand, how do I guide them to the best outcomes? How do I respond to them if they go in a different direction? How do I give them these interesting decisions? How do I make them feel powerful and give them a meaningful pacing for growth and challenge and development, which is what we really look for in our game designers. And finally, it gives you, of course, excellent training in soft skills, which we've talked about. You have to present to be a dungeon master. And I do mean present. You have to communicate your ideas clearly in ways that your players understand. You have to excite them and essentially sell them on a vision, which are great tools for game designers. And of course, any kind of conflict resolution, group management, getting people to work together are things you need as a leader, as a manager, as really any kind of social situation. So again, to summarize, you do learn a little bit about actual content creation and balancing. You learn a lot about writing branching narratives and giving people a chance to have interesting reactions to decisions. Broadly, it forces you to think about your players. Again, one of the most important things you can have as a game designer. And finally, teaches you excellent public speaking and leadership skills, which are broadly useful and wonderful.
All right, which brings us to discussion time. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please use the hashtag PvP21, but I would like to invite Claire back to ask some questions as we move on over to the table.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be questions. Again, if you guys have experiences, if there are educators in the room, and I know there are some who have used these types of game learning, we've heard from some of them earlier, give us some examples. If you've read cool articles, if you've done things, if you've wondered about things, like we really, honestly and truly would like to hear from you.
You know what, I also have to admit that I've been up at this podium for all day, but it is only until we got to our talk that I'm now sweating like a dog. So.
Good job, by the way, Josh. emceeing and then being yourself. Yeah, another round of applause for Emergency MC.
Kia ora, Josh and Rick. Not a question, just wanted to share that being a GM for D&D has been a super rewarding experience. As a programmer by profession, it's a great way to dabble in things like design, world building, acting, and it's also super fun. That was just a comment from Twitter, so.
Nice, wonderful. That's the kind of stuff we want to hear.
So, are there different role-playing games you could recommend to help develop specific skills, ones that aren't just Dungeons & Dragons?
Yeah, I'm going to give you one of my favorite. I like Fate Core. It's a very story-driven system. I really like it for people who are more interested in narrative because the mechanics actually tie into the storytelling in nice ways. For one small example, part of your character is you make something called aspects, which are just things you write about your character. They can be very specific, like Master Swordsman, or very broad and character-based, like, you know, rival of so-and-so other character. And whenever a situation arises where those aspects would be relevant, you can pay some currency to get a bonus. So it feels like really good, where you're like, oh yeah, I said my character is good at this, and so I have a mechanic to make them good at this, versus like, you roll a d20 and you miss, and you're like, what the fuck, I'm a master swordsman, like why am I missing this? You have this mechanic to be like, well, because I said I'm like this, I can do that. And also has this mechanic where you can pay this currency to like take over and kind of mini GM for a moment and be like, because I have the aspect, you know, friends in every port, I actually know this random NPC and we're friends, and then the GM runs with it. And so I like that because again, it encourages this kind of improv, it encourages this collaboration, and it encourages this really interesting storytelling.
Now, I'm actually not too sure if this is, it's more because they actually like just painting the minis, but there is a group at work who actively play Warhammer 40K in order to talk about game mechanics and balancing as well. Now, when I mentioned that part of the great thing about Dungeons & Dragons is that it's open source, that means that we all have the agency to change the game and change the rules to better fit a greater narrative, so to tell a story. Whereas in games like Warhammer 40K, there is a specific balance. If you have someone who has far more powerful units on their side, you are going, like the other person is, or rather, both players aren't going to have fun. So they use it as an element to figure out what is a good balance when approaching a game.
Yeah, good notes on balancing.
Another question, how do you get your players all on the same page in regards to what they want to get out of a campaign?
Nice. Okay, so this really excites me because I grew up in the era when like D&D was really like was getting banned because you summoned devils, and then the church didn't like that, and so it was really hard to find people to play D&D with, and you tended, because I think mostly because we were younger, to get these people who are like, ooh, my character is sacred. My character would be an asshole here and derail things, so you have to respect that. And it took me many years of being a dungeon master to go, no, fuck you. And so now I start my games by saying, hey, everybody, this is a collaborative storytelling event. We are all working together here. I will do my best to give you heroic moments, to take your ideas and bring them in, and to make it meaningful for you. What I expect you to do is buy in. Make a character that cares about what we're doing. Make a character that has a reason to care about the other characters in here. And, you know, find interesting reasons to maybe go outside your character to make this happen. If that's harder, sometimes I'll add some little structure, like, you know, you're all mercenaries working for this company, so you have this professional relation even if you don't like each other, or you're all family members, or you all have this mystical power, which is really fun mechanically, and it kind of unites you. So there are ways you can give them this, but I think it really helps to just like, outside of GM, just being like, listen, humans, we're humans interacting with other humans. Please respect that. That is more important than the rules in your character. That goes a long way.
I'm actually quite a big fan of prevention is much better than the cure, and I think that session zeros are a great way to achieve this. And as we live in the digital age as well, there are so many different ways that we can approach this. I myself like to utilize Google Forms to create surveys that basically ask my players or my potential players what they want to get out of the game. Whether this be things like trigger warnings, or whether or not they have a deep interest in role-playing, or if they just want to murder hobo everybody, I can become better prepared and understand that, hey, perhaps this isn't the group that you want to play with, but if I find another group of murder hobos, I'll give you a call.
One thing I want to throw out to you guys, I'm not qualified to talk about this, but I do want to mention it because there might be things that you have thought of that we haven't, and this is an example of that, is when the last time I spoke at PAX before I moved here, I met some psychologists from Seattle who were implementing Dungeons & Dragons in their therapy. They were these introductory therapy sessions for people who had one reason or another had difficulty engaging with their standard therapy sessions, and had this, again, kind of abstracted layer. Again, please understand that I'm not qualified to talk about how it's actually used psychologically, but it really fascinated me to know that there are actual practicing psychologists using D&D for therapy. And again, I'd love it if there were other people who had thoughts like that we haven't even come across where RPGs could be used for.
That's really interesting. There was actually a comment about how D&D could be used to do marriage counseling or therapy.
Oh, yeah. So there you go.
I'm not sure if, and I didn't really want to speak on this, but I'm not sure if anyone has seen the IT Crowd. There was a fantastic episode where they used D&D to help Roy get over his breakup because he hadn't had the closure. So when they finally save the princess and meet her, and she says, "Hello, Roy."
Right, and Moss and Roy's eyes lock. Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah, but yeah.
That's so good.
2 more questions, and it is, for junior designers eager to find work, is there a way for them to display their DM work in their portfolios?
Ooh, that is a good question. I guess two answers. One, in some ways, if you have done a bunch of world building and have like a lore Bible, like, yeah, throw that in. Because in some ways, it may not be that different from a design doc, depending on what you've done with it. But also, don't be afraid to just mention it casually. Like, if you're in an interview, you know, it's all right to say that. Be like, hey, I've been DMing forever, and so, like, I want to hear that. It may not work with everybody, but, like, to me, that is always, like, a +1 when I'm interviewing people.
Perhaps not as a way for designers specifically, but an interesting conversation that I had with a friend of mine who is a team leader at ANZ was that he, Bank ANZ, ANZ Bank, is that he specifically showed me a portion of his CV which he actually used Dungeons and Dragons as some of his soft skills, or like his how you normally have volunteer work and such. And I believe, if I can look at it here, he said, I scheduled, hosted, and led a team-based event that requires team communication, creative problem solving, and time management.
Beautiful.
The amazing thing is that he said that anybody who asked him follow-up questions about that just had the time of their lives.
All right. Josh and Rick, how do I get involved in D&D living in a small town and having difficulty in social situations? Any advice?
Yeah, I think you covered this a little bit in yours, but, and of course in the talk previous ours mentioned, like, it's the golden age for online role-playing. There's, Roll20 is amazing, like, anyone can sign up there. It's both a mix. You can host your own, but also find other games. And yeah, has maps and character sheets and everything built in, so I think that's really great. Look for online things for sure. I know a lot of people prefer them. That's how I started, by the way. Like, every now and then I'll meet someone who's also my age and who grew up in the age of like chat rooms. Like, when I was in college, there were all these like fantasy-themed chat rooms where it'd be like a tavern or a castle or something. You'd log in as your character and like role play. And like this tattoo was drawn by someone I met 20 years ago in a chat room, and we stayed friends forever until I met her in person 10 years later, and she gave me a giant tattoo. So there are like awesome ways of meeting real friends online in these various forums. And if you don't like live stuff, there's still play-by-post, asynchronous, where there's sites like, what's it called? I think it's just called Roleplay Online, rpol.net, where you like, it's again, just a forum post where people just take turns posting forums, and that allows you to get involved in a game without even having to appear on camera or microphone.
And just to add as well, we are living in an age where D&D, or Dungeons & Dragons, is accessible as it ever has been. Though, like, one of the few things that absolutely turned me away was, as a child, approaching it and being introduced to Thaco. And immediately, all that math just had me running for the hills. But with tools such as D&D Beyond, you have access to so many amazing starter kits and such. So I would honestly just suggest maybe poll your friends, double check to see if anyone else is interested in the game, download the starter kit, and it does a lot of the math for you.
Whenever we send an email out at work to run a new game, there's always like 20 or 30 people that respond. The hardest thing is being like, oh, I can only run for 5 people. Though with that, I know there's a Facebook group. There's just like, you know, Role-Playing Games of Wellington, where people are always posting about looking games. And again, with online tools, you don't need to be limited to your local region. I think that's really great. And yeah, just like set it out there, I think people would be surprised at the response.
Exciting. Last question. Hey, at Blame the Robot, when's our next game from your DM?
Is that Tom?
Doesn't say, actually. It's just on the doc that gets said to me.
Who are you? What game? I mean, this is the kind of unfortunate thing about Dungeons & Dragons enthusiasts as well. It's like, the fact of the matter is, I have no time for my actual life because I'm in 7 games. Someday.
Thank you so much, Josh and Rick.